What's good, guys? What's up, guys? Hope everybody's enjoying your weekend. It's the weekend, right? Saturday, yeah. I finally getting over this nasty chest cold situation. Pretty much feel like I've been sick for the last month. We got over the vid and then got some sort of respiratory infection, respiratory virus, something, and just got over that. So it's been one sickness after another. Finally got back on my feet, trying to get back into the swing of doing these lives again. So I'm gonna try and do one again on Wednesdays and Saturdays as usual. What's good, guys? We had I want to say the last pod I did with Mac Blunt. We had a big discussion about kind of nutrients and stuff like that. And the homie Earl, who's done a few pods with me now, seemed like he had a lot to add to the conversation. I know he's been working on a nutrient line recently. And so kind of felt like getting him on here so we could get kind of his perspective on some things we were discussing, particularly around kind of the use of salt-based nutrients, kind of salt-based nutrients and organic, kind of synthganic, if you will, kind of a best of both worlds situation. And I have, it's probably the one question I get asked more than anything is like, how do I like to grow? Just kind of a tough question because it's not like a simple short, one short answer. I've done a little bit of everything. Started growing pretty much completely organics just because that was what I had access to. And then over time, kind of as my needs changed, kind of learned different things. To be fair, I kind of started, the first thing I ever really did was kind of hydro, like water hydro. And, I always say that's probably the worst way you could start growing just because it's so technical. There's so many different things small things that can go wrong that end up, you got no weed at the end of it. And with water hydro, like hydro, it's so easy to make small mistakes and cost yourself a whole crop that, most people don't even appreciate it, weed man. Thanks, man. Happy to be back on my feet. Most people don't ever bother with it, because it's so technical. Hydroponics in general is water-based hydroponics is so unforgiving. And it's not usually your best way to kind of start out. Most people start out with soil or some sort of soilless mix or something like that, which, to be fair, is a much more forgiving way to grow. Yeah, as time kind of progressed, I ended up picking up more of a kind of soilless cocoa type of stuff. Hey, what's up, buddy?
What's up, man? How you doing?
Much better.
Good.
Much better. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, man. I feel like I've been sick for the last month, man. Like, we got over COVID, and then literally 2 or 3 weeks later caught some other respiratory situation.
Yeah.
I still feel like it was a virus, but I don't know,
Yeah.
And, it to be fair, it was worse than the last 2 times I caught COVID.
Yeah.
And the last 2 times I caught COVID, it was just kind of, mostly a sinus cold. Like, it really wasn't, super bad. And then this, whatever this was, man, it knocked me out of commission for like a week, week and a half. Like, just, I couldn't do shit. Like, it was bad.
Yeah. No, dude, who knows anymore? Every time you turn on the fucking news, there's something new. Fucking,
I saw
yeah,
something the
everybody's
other
feeling
day.
better.
I saw, yeah, thank you. I saw something the other day that said, like, the 26th of August is like the sickest day of the year. And it's because, well, probably more than likely, it's because everybody's kids go back to school.
Yeah.
And like that first week after everybody's kids go back to school, everybody's dragging home whatever their kid brought home,
Yeah.
you know. And so everybody the next week is just blasted sick. And yeah, it is what it is. How you been, man?
Good, dude. Same old shit here. Fucking trekking along. Trying to survive the community, or the industry, I should say, more than anything. But it's going good,
Right.
man. I just complain.
Yeah. Yeah, I was, before you hopped on, I was saying, I want to say maybe the last podcast I did, me and Mac were discussing kind of, grow techniques, nutrients, kind of basic stuff like that. And I felt like you had a lot to contribute, being that you're working with a new, trying to work with a new line of your own,
Yeah.
and it's kind of in your wheelhouse. So I figured it'd be great to have you on and we could chat.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, dude. I appreciate it. Yeah, dude, understanding that food, I think, is a huge, obviously we all talk about genetics and we all talk about atmosphere, but manipulating your plant to take up certain foods and making certain foods available in, at the right times can be huge at expressing your plant and knowing really, especially if we're talking about breeding or trying to take some genetics on to that next level. If you don't know how those genetics express, and how the fuck you gonna know, that, oh, I want this to happen with my plant. Well, you're not properly expressing your plant, so most people aren't gonna get that kind of shit. But it's overlooked a lot, I think. I think a lot of people, it's a lot of those nutrients are exactly the same things. They're the exact same chemical component, whatever the fuck you want to call it, exact same salts, exact same this and that, and changing it up a little bit, in my experience at least, is everything, especially if you want to be different from other people. There's a billion of us. If you want to be different, you got to figure it out somewhere.
Yes. So like when I started growing, at this point, it feels like a lifetime ago. When I started growing, my options were kind of what I had access to at Lowe's, what I had access to, this is the late 90s, early 2000s. We didn't have Amazon.
Yeah.
We didn't have, so like the first time I went into a grow shop, there was a couple of like hydro buckets. There was 2, maybe 3 lines of nutrients, a couple lights.
Yeah.
The world has changed so much in that now when you walk into most grow shops, it's overwhelming the amount of options that you have. So I have to ask, what makes somebody look at a shelf of nutrients, an entire wall of nutrients at the grow shop, and go, there's something that I need to make that's not here?
Sure. So for me, I hunt a ton of seeds. That's all I really do. Like my room's not very big, but I very rarely have more than one pheno of the same plant in there. Sometimes I might have 5 or 6 sisters, but I very rarely have more than one of the same plant. And I was finding, I have my room split so I can test everything. I have 4 different areas, basically 4 different reservoirs that feed my main room. And it's set up that way so I can test. And most of my testing is in the food because it's the reservoirs. The atmosphere has to stay pretty similar. My tray a little closer to my AC might be a little colder than my tray on the,
Quick question. Are we talking about, what's your medium? Like, what do you generally use as a medium?
I usually use cocoa and perlite. I've used
we had this discussion a week ago.
Yeah, and I've used almost everything. Do I have like a smudge on my shit? I don't know. Maybe it's just on my screen. Anyway, that is the one. I think I caught a little bit of it hopping on. It was the most forgiving while still being aggressive. When you take straight hydro or like using straight water, clay pebbles, Grodan, and that kind of shit. Very unforgiving. You have a pump go out, power go out, something, and your plants will die.
So your
Like they're
res
not
just
like
gets a little 6 degrees in the wrong direction, you
yeah,
know? Everything swamps out and you've got slime all over everything, and it's so unforgiving. And that's really why. So the thing that I don't think gets talked about a lot as far as commercial growing goes is the sheer number of salt grows versus organic grows.
yeah,
And for some obvious reasons, on a commercial scale, pure organics can be really tough if you're not growing on a farm, you
yeah,
know?
outside, like yeah,
Um,
for sure.
right. And so when you really get to the back end of most grows, most people aren't growing hydro. Most people are, commercially, most people aren't growing in raised beds. Most people, the largest majority of people are either growing in rock wool, cocoa, or some
Hmm.
sort of soilless mix
Yeah,
because it's cheap, because that stuff can generally be thrown away pretty easily whether you like it or not. That's generally what happens in a large-scale commercial garden. Most of that stuff ends up waste or green
yeah,
waste, and it's the reality is that in the current market where every dollar matters in a commercial grow because the profit margins are so razor thin because taxes are eating a lot of commercial grows up, it's pretty rare that you talk to a grow or see a grow that's anything other than a soilless mix and salt because it's dirt cheap per plant. It's
yeah,
it's
yeah,
about growing as little input as you can, and that's the way most commercial gardens look at it, is that, we kind of need to keep every plant has to be grown as cheaply as possible. Every dollar has to be pinched. So at the end of the day, the cheapest way to grow, especially when you have to have other people handling your plants,
yeah.
it's
No,
going
there.
to be in some sort of soilless mix. So when you're in soil, if let's say you're just growing in soil on a commercial level, bro, those mistakes,
Yeah,
those mistakes that inevitably happen in every grow, it's like turning a cruise ship. I always say organics is like turning a cruise ship. Nothing happens quickly. All the remedies are a big wide turn. Nothing happens on a dime. So, if you're running a grow like that and inevitably somebody's not paying attention, somebody had a rough night the night before, somebody's not, watching what they're doing, now you got a whole bed that's out of whack and you got, a couple $1,000s worth of weed that's going down the trash.
yeah.
So in a commercial in a commercial grow, you kind of have to be able to problem solve quickly. You have to have solutions where, if an idiot messes something up and something's not right, I can come in and fix it without a whole lot of headache and not costing me a ton of money. I'm not going to lose the plants, and that kind of brings us to the conversation. Still, I think that we're kind of having is kind of taking those commercial grows and what can generally, if overdone, produce really mediocre weed, and trying to tweak that in a way that you get a lot of the benefits of both an organic grow, which generally speaking means resin content, things like
Herbs.
that, oil production, versus synthetic grow, which the benefits there tend to be more yields, density, weight, production. And once again, those are usually your biggest factors in a commercial grow. It's optimization, getting as much weed for your dollar as you possibly
Yeah,
can. And at the end of the day, for anybody who's running a large scale commercial grow and who goes, well, look, man, they gave me the bare minimum. All they gave me is an A and a B and maybe a bloom booster. How can I turn that into, cup quality weed? It happens every day. Most of the people that are winning cups, and this is another thing we don't talk about a lot, most of them are not running large commercial organic
sure.
gardens. They're not. And that doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It just means that you can grow great weed a million different ways and get to the same place, but it's just about optimization.
Yeah. Well, and there's things too, like synthetically that you can add. There's like that product terpenes, that works pretty fucking good. I compare it to like a cherry syrup, right? Not in flavor, but in that it will affect everything the same way. If you put cherry syrup in Sprite or in Coke, it affects it the same way. And so they make products where you can run salts, and I've had really, really good flavored flour. But in my experience, organics was the only way I could really express the plant, like fully, you know, like even when I ran full salts, and like I before I made my line, I probably ran like 13 or 14 different bottles through flour just to get like a potassium boost I wanted. This type of, that's the biggest difference between my line. You asked before why I thought there should be something different. I have, in what we're coming out with, multiple forms of potassium, multiple forms of nitrogen, multiple forms of phosphorus. We're creating like a broken down, like a cocoa-based soil, basically cocoa perlite-based soil. We're gonna have multiple forms of organic foods in there. And how I've kind of started looking at food with my plants is almost closer to us. I want to offer a buffet. If my plant, because I'm running, you know, 40 or 50 plants and not one of them is the same. So if this plant likes to get protein from its chicken and this plant likes to get protein from its beef, I want to offer that protein, you know, that nitrogen. If this one wants to get nitrogen from some kind of organic worm casting, and this one actually prefers, you know, some kind of nitrate something, you know, or they prefer different nitrates. I want to try to give them that. And when I was running my room, I ended up running a couple different bases at a time, or like 3 different flowering products at a time.
I hate to interrupt you, man.
No,
this is where I really, the grower in me here has to get some more details. So, first of all, the obvious question is, why would you need or run more than one bases? The second question kind of being, what bases would you run? Because generally speaking, and I kind of don't really want to, you know, every time I say something, somebody ends up going, yeah, but there's an exception. There's always an exception. Yeah. Generally speaking, most nutrient lines, bases, are pretty much the same shit. And most nutrient lines in general are pretty much the same shit. We just get into a discussion of how many bottles do they break it up into, which for some people like to be able to have, you know, tailor their nutrients this way and that way. I think a good base by itself should get you from point A to point B, no matter which one you use by itself. But when we start to talk about optimization and things like yield and things, that's when we start to get into bloom boosters and stuff like that. So that's the other question that I have to ask you, is what bloom boosters were you running as well? Because this is inevitably one of my favorite discussions, because we get into, like you said, overall plant health, but it's where you really get the minutia of growing in the 21st century, as well as there's a little bit of nuance, you know, depending on, like you said, certain nutrient lines are a little different. There's always the outlier. There's always the one that's a little, you know, but I digress. I gave you like 6 questions. Yeah. But why, you know, why multiple bases? So
part of it was because I was getting mad samples. And so I'd just be like, well, I'm moving on to this. I'm moving on to that.
Okay.
But
okay. That makes sense.
In doing that, I was finding, really it started with my PK boosts, because like I was looking at like Rock Resonator, very expensive. I was like, man, could I use this at half strength and just use this other PK, way cheaper, Moab at half strength? And what I was finding was I was able to lower my ECs and keep my plants happy if I just had more than one. It's not about the different companies, it's more about what their nutrients are derived from.
Gotcha.
It's all got to be down into the ionic form. That's really what we're getting. We're getting to, that's the difference between organic and salts. Salts can be uptaken and can go through your root fucking cell wall. They're small enough to be uptaken by your plant. Organics are not yet. And so when you can get, that's the whole part of the organic, is breaking it down. And so my whole method is to break my organics down separate from my plant and then add them. Because you know, once you put them into a high salt area, it's going to kill your microbes and your fungus and shit that's going to break down your food. So if you can break your organic food down first, which is what I just do that I do like a mostly cocoa perlite, like 70/30, but I throw in like some charcoal. It's probably like more realistically like 67/27. And there's like, 8 or 6% of like charcoal. There's a whole list. I have a couple partners in my company, and the one's a chemist, and that's how we kind of figured all this out, because I went through and I'm like, he's like, well, this can't survive together, that can't survive together, we have to take this to this percent, okay, we can try to put this and that in there. And he was able to squeeze in, what I was having to use multiple bases for, because like Front Row Ag uses a different, they get their nitrogen from some other source. So I run them both at half strength, so I can get some nitrogen from this source and shit like that.
So let me ask you another question that inevitably I think is the next logical progression of this conversation. So and it's another touchy one, because I guess everybody's different, right? And this is one of those things that, like, so much, thank you so much. I'm feeling so much better, guys. Thank you so much. Finally getting back on my feet. So what do you feel like PPM-wise is a healthy feed for veg and for flour?
That is, so it's hard to have like a straight answer there, but I like them to fluctuate. The short answer would be, I like, for the same reason I like the different foods. The different acidities of your water can encourage different foods to be uptaken. So, one plant might like to uptake potassium at its biggest percent at 6.1, while another plant might like it at 5.9. And I'm not scientific or smart enough to figure that out. But what I did figure out is, like, what I was doing was I put my nutrients in, they last a week in my reservoirs, and I was pHing every day, and everything was cool, But I found that when I waited, if I'd wait and I'd only pH twice a week or once a week, I was keeping my plants healthier, and the only thing that I could narrow that down to was that fluctuating pH helping.
Oh no! So what's the short answer? You don't have a short answer. Oh. You don't generally.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, short answer. Veg, I'd say like 5, 9, 6 would be my perfect, and flour.
Oh no. PPMs, not pH.
Yeah. Like 2.0, I'd say would be very close on everything all the way around. I play my salts also, so if I notice a little buildup, I get that out of there. And I do also burn my tips a little bit. So that's stupid. And
so now we get into what essentially we should have said from the start, was that every one of those bottles, every one of those nutrients, every one of those labels is going to give you the top end of what they feel like you can use. And of course, there's a vested interest when you sell nutrients for people to go through them a little quicker than necessary. Now, when you say that's essentially 1,000 ppm. That's a hot veg feed. Now, if you're dialed in, if your grow is moving perfectly, every time you feed, you're seeing exponential growth. Everything is dialed perfect. You can use that. You're going to run into a situation if you don't keep, especially in cocoa, you don't keep that newts like 10 to 20% runoff every single feed. Literally. You're going to build up real quick, and it's going to lock. It's going to lock. So what I tend to do, I tend to like more of like a 5 to 700 ppm, which would be like a
1, 2, 1, 3 or something.
1, yeah, like a 1, 1 to 1, 5. Sorry, I had to pull up my EC because I do everything in ppm. But yeah, so like a 1, 1 to a 1, 5, essentially in veg, which tends to be almost a half strength of what the bottle usually says, somewhere in there. And that's usually for smaller plants, closer to 5. As I get into like a decent sized veg, 7, closer to a 750 or 1.5, and then into flour, I would be closer, especially at peak, I would be closer to what you said. 1,000 ppm was a 2.0.
Yeah, sure.
That's where I would, that's where I would be comfortable. But to be fair, I'm reading the room the whole time.
Sure.
So if I see plants that aren't looking, here or there, it doesn't look like it's going to be a quick solve. You always kind of hit that peak. You want that peak to be that 3 weeks, 4 weeks towards the middle and end of flower where you're really bulking.
Yeah.
Because the truth is, when you're in that, and the other thing that I don't really like to do is I don't go in with PK at all, anything different than just a base until week 3. So once you've hit week 3 of flower and I can see sets forming, now they have a need for extra phosphorus and potassium. And until that point, giving them to them is just going to be more than they need, and they're still uptaking a reasonable amount of nitrogen at that point. Because even going into week 2 of flower, you're still throwing a lot of vegetative growth. So you're just seeing tons of leaves, and that's usually a good indicator. They don't need a ton more phosphorus. Like, you throwing more phosphorus at them isn't going to shock them into flower harder. What it's going to do is have them freak out at that peak transition period, which is one of your most important periods. That week 2 to week 4 of flower, and just getting out of veg into flower fully, as far as watching for herms, as far as watching for stress, as far as, just about everything. That transition is one of the most important in your plant's life, period. And nailing that, getting that so that there's no stress there, the plant has what it needs, but it's not, stacking extra shit in its root zone that it doesn't need. Really keeping that balance fine is where you see the most explosive growth. Once they hit that week 3 of flower, and you can go, okay, it doesn't just look like a vegetative weed plant anymore. Now it looks like something's happening. Like, that's that point where you really want to transition more into, and even then, like I say, depending on your grow style, like, I don't like to throw the kitchen sink. After years of being more heavy-handed with nutrients and feeding, I've kind of gotten towards a less is more. So this kind of, once again, butt ends kind of what we originally talked about wanting to discuss, was Synthganic, the process of using, organic inputs in a synthetic setup or a non-soil setup, and really optimizing everything there. So one of the things that I love is bacterials, inoculants, anything like that. Big fan. I'm a big fan of things like kelp, seaweed, teas, the things that you would normally use in an organic setup, especially in veg, and especially when you're transitioning up pots. So another thing we don't really discuss a lot is sizes of pots matter, and how those up pots go really matters.
Yeah.
So I'm a huge fan of red cups. I've always been a big fan of red cups, just red solo cups, slice some holes in the bottom of them. They're reusable. They're great. They're easy to clean. They're easy to throw away if you just have to, something goes wrong and you need to just waste a bunch of them. And going from that to a 1 gallon to a 5 gallon and timing those perfectly. And then especially in cocoa, because when you're going into fresh cocoa, there's nothing there.
Sure.
It's not like soil where you have all your nutrients are already in there. Nothing there. So that's when I really, really like stuff like kelp, seaweed, bacterials, because that's going to stimulate that root growth in those first couple weeks. And that's really generally when I use it, because it's still going to aid in those transitions just as much as it would if you were in soil. Those are all things that really stimulate root zone, growth and just explosive root growth. And so once you get into you can start to see roots out the bottom of your pot and you're pretty well established, then you kind of don't need as much of that, because it's just going to accumulate in your cocoa. And it's, it's really great when you have that explosive root growth early on from a transplant. But like, one of the things that another timing thing that is absolutely clutch is hitting those up pots timely, because having those roots fill that pot but not get so full that they stop growing is clutch.
No, for sure. I think I know I always find a way to bring them up. Autoflowers are a very good example of that. because if you run an autoflower a little too long, talk about unforgiving. Like if you can even get that motherfucker to survive, if you run in a small pot a little too long. But yeah, I think you're right. One thing too, I run my shit weird. So I run a 2.0 for sure, but I also run like a straight flush day, where I run all organic teas and I run a lot of them. So it flushes once a week. I water 4 times a day. I only flour in a 1 gallon pot, cloth, but I water 4 times a day. And I also use a lot of organic additives as far as like adding some like organic broken down cocoa to the top of my pot. So I really run like 3/4 of it. And then when I get into like week 5 or 6, I like to add that extra organic. What I really like to do is I throw a sulfur layer down, because sulfur will kill all your fucking. I know everything I put in there is going to die as far as microbiology.
That's not the case. That's
It's
not the
like
case.
what was hitting like a fucking 2.5, 2.6 EC buildup probably. And so
Yeah,
it's
if
like,
you're building, see, that's the thing, and that's the balance. So when you're using most bacterial or fungal inoculants, you're talking about millions, if not billions, of units, essentially active units that you're inoculating with. So as long as you don't hit a toxic buildup situation,
yeah,
your root zone will generally still contain and have thriving microbacteria. And that's not something that, like, I feel like we've always looked at that as a community as a real blunt hammer, that like as soon as you use anything salt based, now all your microbes died. That's not really the case.
nice.
And
That's
that's
awesome.
the point of using them for me, is really like, and you can tend to see when you've got super fuzzy roots everywhere,
Yeah,
it generally means they're working and they're doing what they need. And you can almost tell when they're not. If you put 2 plants, one used them and one didn't, you can almost always tell. There is a little bit of, and it's the problem that we have all had, that anybody that's ever done salt-based anything for enough time, is that if you don't keep a 15% runoff at least, you're going to build up salt, you're going to end up with an anaerobic environment, you're going to kill off microbes. It's going to happen. Doesn't mean necessarily everything in your root zone is going to be dead. But the reality of it is you start to see declines in your population of bacteria the more that accumulates, and it's a problem that we all see. And that's the big thing with salt, anything that's involving salt, is that you have to keep a monitor on that the whole time. So
for
if
sure.
you're feeding it 2 EC, if what's coming out isn't also 2 EC, you've got a problem. And that problem is only going to compound until you remedy the fact that there's more there than needs to be.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the trick, is, depending on the size of your grow, right? A great grower is in any size grow, especially if you're running salt and you're running a commercial setup. Literally, you're going through once a day, pulling random plants and testing EC every, 1 a table, 2 a table. If you ever see something that's wonky, you're doing it. And that way you can make those adjustments on the fly, and you don't necessarily have those situations, because as soon as you lock up, you're losing money.
For
As soon
sure.
as you lock up, you're losing production. And I see so many people, one of my biggest pet peeves, when I'm scanning the internet, when I'm scanning Reddit, when I'm scanning Instagram, I see plants that are clearly locked up. Time for flower.
Yeah,
No.
yeah.
No.
Wait a little bit.
If you have a plant that doesn't look perfect, and learn what perfect plants look like. Seen a million of them. Look at plants online. Look at pictures until you know what a healthy plant and a not healthy plant looks like. You don't need to know what every nutrient issue looks like.
Sure.
Just know what a perfectly healthy plant looks like, and figure out what one that doesn't look like that looks like. That's going to be the easiest way to tell that you have a problem. Solving your problem isn't going to be a matter of, I've got to figure out exactly which nutrient is off. Because if you're in a salt environment and you've got a salt buildup in your root zone, it could be any of them. Solving the problem, the overlaying problem, is the issue. And so it's another one of my pet peeves, is just like, here's a single leaf. Tell me what's wrong with my garden. And it's like, that's not how this works either. Like, I need to know, what are you growing in? What's your environment? Soil or cocoa? salts are organics. Like, there's a million ways to grow weed. So to look at one leaf and say, I mean, I might be able to tell you, okay, it looks like you got a phosphorus problem, but that doesn't really tell you much as far as solving it,
Adding phosphorus might be making it worse.
Right, exactly.
You might have a pH problem. You might have a buildup. I worked in a shop here. I know a lot of people have stigmas towards shops. I worked in a shop here. I was lucky enough. The shop I got into was pretty badass. The guys that were there had been growing for 20, 30 years at the time, and they knew their shit. And we had that all the time, dude. What's going on? They bring it in a bag. You'd be able to like see bugs in the bag. I'm not talking shit. I'm just saying like, and it's what's wrong. So, well, right off the bat, you have aphids. But I can tell you this, in the hundreds of gardens that I fixed in there, from like looking at leaves, if you can measure your runoff, like you just said, the EC, so I like to use EC, and so parts per million was always hard for me because there's the 500 and 700 scale that different nutrient companies use.
Yeah.
And so whenever I was in the shop, I'd always make everybody go to EC. I always say, well, what's the EC? Because I'd say, well, what ppm do you use? And they wouldn't know. And I'd say, well, what nutrient line do you use? And I'd have to go to that nutrient line and see what ppm they were measuring. But if you can measure your ppm or EC and your pH, you can probably solve most of your problems, as long as you know your atmosphere as well, I guess. But that's
the other thing is that we don't talk about a lot is that most of the time the problem is overwatering.
Sure, yeah. Especially if you're in fucking soil.
Soil or cocoa, because like that's the other big misconception. Yes, you can. Let me answer that question in 2 seconds. Damn it, and I lost it that quick.
No, you were talking about overwatering in cocoa. It's a misconception. You can't do it.
Overwatering, the myth is that generally you can just drown your plants when they're in cocoa. There's no such thing as too much water, and that's absolute horseshit. Cannabis hates soggy roots. It loves pretty much a process of drying out every other day. So if you're having to water every single day, look at something there. You're probably either in too light of a medium or your roots are a little too big for your pot. Like, you almost always want to be in an every other day cycle. And that's pretty much generally what I've seen. They uptake best. They're moving through water best. The question somebody asked real quick that I'll hit on just because it was a good question is, can you take cuts in flower? You can. It's always best to do it in week 1 or week 2. Because by the time week 3 comes around, the plant is now transitioning into flower. So a lot is changing heavily. I've heard of people, and it's not my thing, but I've heard of people that only like to take cuts in first week of flower. Something having to do with hormones and whatever the argument was, they told me at the time it made sense.
Yeah.
But it's not something that I've really... Yeah, I've always kind of liked them to be peak veg. So, like, while my plants are just literally producing as much vegetative growth as humanly possible, that's when I generally want to take my cuts. But if you're in a situation where you have to, man, I've seen people do crazy stuff. I've seen people take a single bud and re-veg a single bud. I've seen people take, like plants that were pretty much completely dead and almost done flowering and re-veg them. At that point, you kind of treat them like bonsai plants if you really need to. You cut out most of the root zone. You put them back in a tiny little pot. You switch them back over to heavy veg, newts and stuff. But you can. It's not my favorite thing to do, generally speaking. But, yeah, sure, you can take cuts in flower.
In case of emergency, if I lose clones or something, and I'm like, fuck, the only plant I have of this is in flower. Right. I don't want to lose this plant. I'm gonna take clones, no matter where it is in flower. I'm trying, and I'm gonna probably try to re-veg that plant too.
Yeah.
But cut down like most of it at the end, and then fucking throw it back into 24-hour light.
Yeah, I mean,
some don't.
To be honest with you, man, it's been a long, and I've had these weird discussions with myself lately about just how much like my opinions and my kind of perception of genetics is these days versus when I was coming up. And like, was struggling to find plants and didn't really have solid genetics and just was running whatever I could get my hands on. And, back then I would covet every strain I got. Like every strain meant something to me, and every strain was a different memory, right? Because you only had so many of them. In the earliest days for me, when I started growing weed, we didn't have a ton of options. So you weren't really getting seeds off the internet. There was no, seed internet. And a lot of it was you either went to Amsterdam, you went to Canada, or you bought them through a magazine like Skunk or, Mark Emery or something like that. And so when you were lucky enough to come across something that was legitimate and that was unique, it meant something because you'd never seen anything like that before. Now, 20 years later, it's almost hard for me to get really excited about a strain, at least past making it. Like, I love to make new strains, but once I've made new seeds, there's almost never a point where I go, oh man, I lost that plant. Like, I have to get it.
Yeah.
I just pop more seeds.
I have to have
And
it.
so, like, I guess it comes from, like, a place of now I have, almost an unlimited amount of genetics at my fingertips. Whereas when I was first coming up, every flavor was new and unique and different. And it was a special story about how you got it. And, and I don't know. It's one of those weird things that now I think about that all the time. I'm like, is there a strain that if I lost it, it would just be the end of, nah.
Yeah.
I just
No, you're
make
right.
something else. I just make something new and make something unique. And I don't know, man, for me, there was a point where it changed of like trying to see what all was out there versus now let's see what we can make that's new. And when you go from that different kind of look at things, it's like you're accepting it. It's when you first get into music, right? Every new music you hear is this new special experience, and you remember where you heard it the first time and how it made you feel. A lot of people, that's weed. Especially once you get out of the it's just weed phase and you start to get into strains and varieties and flavors. Each strain is like a song. It's like a different moment in your life where you found it, how it made you feel. Did it, we got baked and went to the football game, or we got, whatever the moment is for you. And it's like once you go from you're just enjoying the moments to now you make the moments. Yeah, I guess it's kind of similar because I spend a lot of time in music on the front end, and it's completely different when you're standing in front of a stage and you're admiring a band that you've paid some ungodly amount of money to see, and you're stoked to hear their songs. And once you finally are on the stage, like I said, once you see how the sausage is made, it's all a different thing. Like it's hard to go back to just being a fan in the audience. And that's kind of one of those, like, I always say I'm looking for the next thing, but I'm looking for the next thing that slaps me across the face. I want to be wowed in a world of I've seen this band before. We've all seen the garage act or the cover band who's 20 years past their prime. And, there's a certain amount of nostalgia to that. That's fun, but at the end of the day, you really want those moments where you're dragging yourself out of a show and you just go, I don't know what just happened, but it was the greatest moment of my life.
Sure, yeah.
And I look at weed these days the same way as I'm looking for that thing that makes me just go, wow. Like I didn't see that coming,
Yeah, no, that is always fun. When you get surprised. One of my favorite things to do, and it's just probably because I'm new, is to like recognize distant lineage where like when you deal with like the mom or the great granddad, sisters or whatever, and all of a sudden you find this cut and you're like, holy shit, this is just like that plant back then, or this is like you have to maybe think about it even for a second. That's probably one of my favorite things to do with weed now. But as far as you said, there's always for me still, there's like a lot of new flavor, things a little different. That's my favorite thing to do, bro, when why I run my plants so hard. So I run a real high ppm CO2. I run like 1800 to 2000 par. Like I'm beating these little bitches up. And but the synthganic, dude, what we were talking about with all that was like a big step up for me to be able to handle a lot of this. because it allowed me to do even more forms of that food that we were talking about. I just have a little bit different. Not that it's right, but the more forms of the food that I can get in there that's derived from is really what I went for it, and it's allowed me to run all these different pheno and not have very many like deficiencies of this. And a lot of it's because I'm running it so hot, because it's like, how could it not have enough of something when I'm giving it way more than most plants want of it? But I fucking love it, dude. Do you run synthesis? Do you run salt and organic, or are you just straight organic? Salt and organic?
I've done both. Like I did pretty much for 18 years. Did all kind of like a super soil type of situation. Long before people knew what KNF was, and the new wave of new organics, and grew tons of dank weed. I hit a point where I genuinely felt like I didn't always feel like I was getting the most bang for my buck. So I'd grow tons of dank weed, but at the end of the day, I'd go, I felt like I could have done more.
Yeah.
You
hear about other people's weights and shit.
It's not even weight. It's like it's not even necessarily that. For me, it's more of just optimization. So if at the end of the day, the goal is optimization, to me, I look at it more like a bodybuilder, except that there's a difference between a dude who likes to go to the gym and a dude who is an absolute animal. And it's usually optimization, aside from the obvious steroids. But let's be honest, that's all part of the package. Like, we're all using anything we can to get to the end of the road the best way we can. And it's just about optimization. So what I tended to see too, like I said, if you've ever been in a situation where you got to go somewhere and somebody else has to run your grow for you, you tend to understand how much a day can affect your yield. So one person making a bad decision in a grow can cost you, the whole crop.
Yeah.
And in that moment, it's easier in a soilless environment to fix the problem than it is if you're in organics. So, we kind of get into a scale situation. What is your situation? If you're running 4 plants in a tent, organics is super feasible for you. Please do it. If you're running a 4x8 and you're running 20 plants, run organics. It's probably your best bet. But if you're running a decent sized grow and you ever want to have a life, you ever want to be able to walk away and hand somebody else the grow and say, hey man, you got to deal with it today, then you've probably been through that situation more than once where somebody made a mistake and it cost you a ton of money, or it cost you a whole crop, or it cost, and at the end of the day, that's kind of optimization and ease of fixing problems was kind of what made me start to look at running synthetics in general. And then I did, what anybody I came from originally running hydro. So I had a lot of background in salts and nutrients and stuff like that. I kind of did that for a couple crops and then just went, this is great. But back then, the nutrients were so shitty and so basic that you would grow these hugely explosive, large plants, but they were never terpy. Just had a really bland profile, no oil, like just not great. And so I did a couple rounds when I first started, did a couple rounds of like just hydro and tinkering, building DWC buckets and just playing. And so I had a little bit of experience with salt. When I went into cocoa, I kind of looked at it as, okay, so I know now what grows dank, terpy, organic weed. Like I've done that for 20 years, 18 years, and now I have a good example of what that is. So I did everything I could. I tried 8 or 10 different nutrient lines. I ran House and Garden, and I ran Canna, and I ran a kind of blend that a buddy put together, a dude that worked at a grow that I worked at, and they were running this, just a salt mix that he had put together. I ran that. And I'm going to be honest with you, that particularly, because it was all I ran. It was one of those where you said, you know, you've got whatever's laying around. I had that laying around. I had to get a crop going, and I ran it. It was the worst grow I've ever had. It was one of the worst grows ever. It was just a basic base, no real PK. And it was just a base salt that, like you said, you kind of made a slurry and then cut that down to you know, and so I tried a bunch of different stuff, and I worked in a ton of commercial gardens, and so I saw on a large scale what worked and what didn't, what was easy to fix and what wasn't. I watched a couple of nutrient companies come out of nowhere. So go from, you know, a brand new company to now all over the shelves, and have, you know, some experience and stories with that were kind of weird, where I was working for a company that was testing a brand new nutrient line. And we all kind of know liquid nutrients should not precipitate. So they should stay in suspension. That should pretty much be the case till the nutrients end of its life, generally speaking. And so this was a new company. They were essentially trying to partner with large-scale commercial gardens to have these places almost beta test their nutrients, which if you're kind of dialed in and things are looking good for you, that's not a big deal. One of the first times that I had to run it on my own, and I won't say the name because they've changed their formulas. They've come a long way since then. I don't really want to shit on anybody. So I pour, at this point, I'm making 100+ gallon reservoirs at a time. So I have to pour, you know, half of a graduated cylinder full of nutrients. So I pour my newts, and literally you can just watch the salt crash out. And you can just watch it crash to the bottom of the beaker.
You put pH up on there.
Yeah, the first time I watched that, I asked the dude, the rep, I said, what do you think happens in the pot? If it does that in the beaker, what do you think happens in the pot? Because the same exact thing's going to happen. The heavy shit settles to the bottom, and then the first time your plants dry out, those roots contract, and they grab all of that shit, and now you're locked the fuck out.
Yeah, that's
exactly what happened, you know?
Dude, there's been wild shit, at least at the time that I was at the shop, that nutrient or medium companies really fuck stuff up. Where like we'd figure it out sometimes, you know, because it's like somebody came in and they're complaining about this or that. You go through everything, and then all of a sudden okay, well, what's the next possibility? We tested all the fucking water that they use, everything. So okay, let's test these nutrients, and you throw them in, and they come out to like a 3-something or pH, or like that was one that was like a pretty big fucking nutrient line. It had a whole batch that was just way something fell out, something happened. Someone's run, and people's whole gardens died. You know, if you can read your garden, like we were talking before, though, a lot of that you can, and you're running cocoa, like, you know, and you can actually change now. You don't have to do the big it's got to get worse before it can get better kind of fucking shit.
So let me tell you in 30 seconds. Let me tell you the whole story about the bad nutrient line, right? So when I started at this commercial grow, it was one of the 3 biggest in the state of Colorado at the time. This was an 80,000 square foot facility. So these were massive open rooms, which is probably the worst way you can grow weed.
Yeah.
And so day one, I walk in, every plant in the building is dying. Like, they're not, it's not, they don't have a small lockout problem. Every plant is dying. So, you know, once again, the sleuth in me is like, all right, let's start at the beginning. You know, what's our cocoa situation? Oh, well, we got this new batch of cocoa. We saved a bunch of money because it was like super brand new and like they, you know, this, yeah. And so I said, okay, so you probably got a problem with your cocoa. What's your nutrient situation? So they showed me the nutrients and I watched the shit fall out in the beaker and I'm like, okay, you don't have just one small problem. You have two massive problems. Both your nutrients and your medium are fucked. They're garbage. Neither one of them is worth a shit. I don't know. Okay, so cocoa is one of those weird things that like, if it's not handled properly previous to, there's a lot of nasty. Could just be, you know,
Need to be
I
washed with
joked.
calcium.
Yeah, I
And
joked that it seemed like somebody had just pissed in it. They had just piled it up in a warehouse and everybody pissed on it because it just seemed like it had toxic amounts of something. I mean, like, you know, trying to figure out what it is not really the point. So inevitably, there was a solution. Like, there's always a solution, and it's usually waste a bunch of money because if you have to use that, your best bet is to just flood the zone, just overly flood the nutrients to the point where you literally don't think you can put any more water through it, then flood it some more. Eventually whatever's in there will wash out because that's the nature of cocoa. If you put enough water through it, whatever the problem is gonna. So like I took over at that point a smaller test grow. It was maybe 250 lights, right? And so they pretty much tasked me with like, we need you to solve this problem. And I said, okay, if you want to run it like this, you're gonna have to just overfeed. So the amount of money that you're going to waste in just flushing all of this is going to cost you thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. Because once again, talking about hundreds, if not thousands of plants. I mean, you're talking about weeks of work. You're talking about labor. You're talking about lights. You know, like there's cheaper ways and easier ways to grow weed. Number one is find a professional.
Yeah, well, and it's dude, that's so funny because that's so similar to my first, maybe not my first real big garden experience, but the first one where I actually like ran the entire garden.
We got 3 minutes.
Okay, yeah, it can be fast. When I got there, everything was dying, everything was dead. They wouldn't let me cut down the first run. They were like, "You just start in veg," and I was like, "Yeah, that sounds great," because I saw the fucking flower room, you know, which was completely unlike when I actually had first visited, which was super funny. So I had visited, I didn't realize they still had their like head gardener there. They let him go. They hired me. I can't because they killed everything pretty quick. I go through there. Believe the stories of these places are just about the money, guys. Like I'm telling you, the day I got done with all the shit. I've been fighting for fucking 7-8 months to get my contract signed by them. All the fucking stories you hear people say. That day, they're like see ya. I already had no. I didn't like it there. Longer story short.
I could have told that story for you. I've heard that story so many times. I could tell that story for you.
But
anyway.
Messages from people that work there, you know, a month later, still questions, people ask me shit, but everything's dead again. And it's just because they tried to save money on underwatering. They wouldn't run water to run off. They ran salts. They watered a couple times a day in cocoa. And that was 100% it. Just like not watering it right. 100% of it.
Yeah. I mean, that's the other thing is like, we can have a whole nother hour about irrigation and the pros and cons of irrigated gardens and scale and things like that. Anyway, we'll do it again, Earl. Yeah. Every time it's a pleasure, buddy. Hour goes by quick. www.terpfiend.com. I am the Regal Beagle. Yeah. Anywhere else folks can follow you, buddy?
Yeah, I'm the Regal Beagle. I'm on Discord. I'm on fucking here. I got some Facebook stuff. But I got that podcast you've been on too. The Grow Hour, the Weedman 420 Chronicles.
Shout
everywhere.
Out to Weedman, huge fan, Weedman 420. You guys do great work there too. Very professional, I got to say, much more professional than my outfit. But always a great discussion with you guys, man. I always appreciate it, and huge shout out to Weedman. Thanks you guys so much. We're gonna do another one on Wednesday. Me and Mac Blunts. Peace.